In this video, we're going to look at how we use object mode. We can use object mode to do some basic manipulation of our objects, and we can also use it to add content into our scene. Object mode is the only way that we can actually add geometric content into our scene. So you'll notice here I've just opened up Blender. I have my default cube here, and in object mode I can do some fairly minor things with the objects to deal with them, and one of them is the move, which I've just clicked on. I'm just going to actually move this to the left a little bit. I'm going to raise it a little bit so it's kind of sitting on the image plane. Remember, you can orbit around your workspace by pressing down the scroll wheel and holding and just manipulating and moving your mouse around. But essentially what I want to do here, now I've moved that cube out of the way, is show you how to bring a second object into our workspace to work with. You'll remember from the first video that the cursor, or the 3D cursor, is the location of where the new content will be generated. So at the moment the cursor is on the starting origin point, which is what we call 0, 0, 0. And you'll notice over here, if I go to my properties inspector, you'll see 0 degrees, 0 degrees, 0 degrees with the kind of rotation for the object. If I move the cursor, it changes where the object will come into the art space. So I'm just trying to offset the cube here by creating an object over in this space. And the way that we create a new object is pretty simple. We need to make sure we're in object mode, of course, and we just go to add. You'll see there's a whole lot of options here for a whole lot of things which might be confusing, but what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a thing called a simple primitive or a simple mesh, which is the first option that we have to work with. And you'll see as I've highlighted the options there, we can bring in a plane, which is just like a flat square object. We can bring in a cube, which is the default setting, a circle, which is a little bit like the plane. It's a flat circular object. A UV sphere, which is really just a three-dimensional circle or sphere, very descriptive. Icosphere, which is like a geometric shape, cylinder, cone, and a torus. And there's also a little monkey there, which is kind of a character which you can bring in as a little bit of default. So we've got a cube in already. I'm just going to click on a cylinder to bring in, because a cylinder's also a pretty good building block to work with. And I'm just going to click on the cylinder, and you'll notice that a default cylinder has appeared inside the workspace. Now I actually want to modify the properties of the new cylinder, and a really important thing about Blender is when you use a tool, the tool properties will appear down here in the bottom left hand side. So you can see here I've got add cylinder has appeared, and that only appears when I do that function. Eagle-eyed watchers will have noticed that previously it said move down there because it basically highlights the last tool that you've worked with. But what's great about the properties here, if I just expand it out, it actually gives me a whole lot of options to work with my object that I've just brought in. So at the moment it's talking about vertices, and that's kind of the sides of the cylinder, and it says 32. And I can decrease it, and if you watch as I decrease, the cylinder becomes less circular and more kind of a block. And if I go down to 3, I kind of get a triangle. I can't go any less than that because I need that many vertices for a three-dimensional object. But if I go past 32, I get a much more detailed option. And this is the way that we can actually manipulate a lot of these simple primitives or geometry to modify them into slightly different shapes. So let's imagine I was modeling something which needed like a pentagon or a hexagon shape. I can start with a cylinder and just reduce the number of vertices to create that shape with it. I can also play around with the radius, so how wide it is in this tool, and I'll just push it up to 2 meters. I can actually just type that in, and I can also play with the depth or how high it is. And you'll notice as I'm increasing it, it's expanding it from both the above the plane that everything sits on and below the plane everything sits on. So it's just expanding it out from that center point. I can also change the location and the rotation with that object as well. Remember, this add cylinder box only will appear when I go add and create the object to come in, otherwise it will disappear. And I'll show you how it will disappear, because I'm just going to move over to some of my basic object tools over here. I'm going to go to rotate, because I'm going to rotate it around. So the rotation tool has been selected, so if I click on the tool and I'm just going to pivot it, you'll notice that the modifier tool has disappeared over at the bottom left, and the rotate options have come out. And if I rotate it 90 degrees, which was my intention, to just pivot it on its side, I could just type in 90 degrees if I wanted. I should really have done that. You can type things in. And you can also modify the axes, which the content is rotated around. So, and also the z-axis, that's not actually made any particular change. So every time you click on a tool like move or rotate or size, or even create an object, you get the tools options down here on the bottom left hand side to work with. I can also move the object around, so I'm just going to move it so it intersects with my rectangle. If you're wondering which object it is that you're modifying, you'll see it's highlighted in orange here on the screen. And also, if you go up to the properties at the top right hand side, the object that you're working with will have this kind of blue line on it. So if I want to work with the cube now, I can click on the cube, and I'm just going to make sure I've got my selection arrow on, and that will select the cube. And if we have a look up here in the scene inspections, you'll actually see that that tool is there. So I can do a little bit of creative work. So I'm just going to play around with my scale and make this cube less of a cube and do a little bit of a movement. And so this is really where the power of working with this 3D software can come into being, that I'm not actually doing a tremendous amount of modification to the content that I've got, but I have gone from having a cylinder and a cube into two quite unique objects now, just working my object mode. So it's something that you want to have a play with and get used to using. It's not as powerful as the edit mode, which we'll look at in the next video, but it allows us to do a lot of really, really basic work, particularly for the kind of constructs that we're making. So I want to create another cube to go on the end, and I'm just going to position my 3D cursor where I kind of want it to originate from. So I've clicked it where I want it to come from. Again, we just go add, go to mesh, and I'm going to choose cube. Again, you'll notice down here at the bottom left, I've got my cube options to work with, so I can play around with the size of it and also the location of it. So I'm going to pop it out, and then I can do things like scale it, make it a bit smaller, and then just position it back inside my object. You'll notice when I'm using these tools, I'm using these little selection arrows which you get with it, but you can also just kind of freely move the object around without using these arrows. The reason why I'm using the arrows is that you can be very accurate with where you place things, but with the move tool selected, I can actually just, you see, I can just click on it. I've got two objects clicked on at the moment, and move it around. It's not actually doing it for me, but it should be. There we go. I've just jumped inside the white circle, and I can freely move the object around the space. So click, select the white object, and you can kind of freeform move and scale things. Doesn't matter what kind of method that you use for these tools, but you should think about working with the tool which works best for you. So in the next video, we're going to move beyond working in object mode, and we're going to move over to the edit mode. And the edit mode is where we have the real power of working with these 3D modeling software packages. It's going to allow us to add pieces and delete pieces of the simple objects that we've started with. So that will be the next video.